Cascading Events, Technology, and the Floods Directive, Future Challenges, written by Gianluca Pescaroli and Michael Nunez, published by the Institute for Risk and Disaster Prevention, University College London, Gower Street, WC1E 6BT, London, United Kingdom. Published in 2016 at the Third European Conference of Flood Risk Management. This presentation was given. Abstract. Cascading events can be referred to multidimensional disasters, where a primary trigger generates a nonlinear series of secondary emergencies that escalate in time, becoming eventually the priority to tackle. In this process, critical infrastructure can be handled as roots of vulnerabilities because they accumulate both physical attributes and functional nodes. When compromised, they produce widespread breakdowns of society, but also orient emergency responses and long-term recovery. Although floods have been widely associated to the failure of vulnerable equipments or to the disruption of strategic sectors such as energy, communication, and transportation, their integration with the emerging concept of cascading has been limited. This open topic presents many challenges for scholars, researchers, and practitioners, in particular when the implementation of the EU Floods Directive is considered. The paper presents an overview of the Floods Directive and its relation with the cascading events, using case studies and examples from the existing literature to point out missing links and gaps in the legislation. Conclusions argue that the directive considers only local geographical scales and limited temporal horizons, which can be resulting in inadequate. It can result inadequate to limit the escalation of events. Part 1, Introduction. Floods are considered one of the most critical categories of disaster in Europe for their wide and strong recurrence. Over the period 1986 to 2006, it has caused estimated damages for over 100 billion euro. The potential impact of the phenomena is not only related to environmental and natural causes, but also has consistent anthropic roots. That means human causes. In the recent decades, economic and insured losses associated with flooding events have drastically increased for their correlation to socioeconomic drivers and political decisions, such as strategies of spatial planning or land use management. Despite the adoption of new mitigation measures, it is probable that the trend will continue for the future. Indeed, on the one hand, flood-prone areas remain attractive for human activities, and the higher consummation of land is likely to increase the damage potential in the near future. On the other hand, it is known that the frequency and magnitude of flooding events may increase because of climate change patterns exacerbated by the industrial process and urban pollution. I don't see how this is related, other than this diagram looking like the intelligence cycle. So I guess for a location, you would have a flood risk assessment done on the location, but this is about critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure plays a central role in the development of the European well-being. It represents a consistent part of the built environment, and its components can be both concentrated and diffused in space. For example, in the electricity sector, generation is assured by localized power plants and the distribution by long-range grids. As human settlements are often located in flood-prone areas, critical infrastructure can be threatened by flooding events, generating consequences that go beyond the flooded regions. Cascading events. critical infrastructures, and multiple stressors. In this section, we explain the concept of cascading events and derive two vulnerability drivers that could be used to test the European Floods Directive, critical infrastructure, and multiple stressors in river systems. 3.1 Cascading events. The relevance of cascading events and interconnected risks has grown sensibly during the last years. The early approach can be referred to the idea that toppling dominoes activate a series of causal chain effects. Other authors suggested the idea that branching tree of emergencies are triggered by a primary threat. As an example, the vulnerability of society to complex crises has been highlighted by events such as the air transportation shot down triggered by the 2010 eruption of Ijafalajoku and the Fukushima meltdown that hit Japan in 2011. The increased knowledge of globally networked risks and the sensibility of their interdependencies required a shift in the paradigm of knowledge. Therefore, Pasquaroli and Alexander proposed a comprehensive approach to cascading events, arguing that they are distinguished by the existence of unforeseen and nonlinear paths of subsidiary events. The crisis escalates as time progresses instead of being stabilized by the full mobilization of emergency resources, spreading towards the vulnerabilities of society and the disruption of functional nodes such as critical infrastructure. Although cascading effects are associated with complex chain failures in human subsystems, cascading events or cascading disasters have a higher level of complexity and escalation where the gravity of the secondary crisis tend to distinguish it from the primary trigger. So in figure 2, we see the linear path of events as column A. Column B, nonlinear path of cascading events. Thus, the application of cascading concept to the management of this terror activity, for example, it suggested the need to shift from hazards assessment to social vulnerability assessment. This process has different components, and any consideration about multi-hazards interactions and management strategies has to join together environmental and anthropogenic processes. According to Pasquaroli and Alexander, cascading events are manifested as a consequence of vulnerabilities accumulated in different scales and systemic levels, such as the environment, socio-technological drivers like globalization or local institutions, interdependent critical infrastructure, like in figure 3, where we see a vulnerability path of cascading disasters and cross-scale interactions. So we see like environmental triggers. Over a long, slow period of time, environmental triggers can create, and then human systems underneath. And the exposure is on a separate plane. This is an interesting graph. So this, according to Pasquaroli and Alexander, cascading events are manifested. That means they happen in real life as a consequence of vulnerabilities accumulated in different scales and systemic levels. such as the environment, socio-technological drivers, or interdependent critical infrastructure. Consequently, cascades are more dependent by contextual dynamics associated with the pre-existing factors and social feedbacks explained in the model proposed by Alexander. Page 24 of his report says that at the micro scale, they correspond to roots such as corruption, negligence, or unsafe conditions of production, which become unsustainable weaknesses of socioeconomic models at the macro scale. Critical infrastructure can be seen as the recurrent element where fragilities, weak elements, are accumulated at the micro level, activating feedbacks to larger scale and acting as systems for their role of functional nodes. Indeed, following the Directive on European Critical Infrastructures, released in 2008, these are defined as an asset which is essential for the maintenance of vital societal functions, health, safety, security, economic, or social well-being of people, and the disruption or destruction of which would have a significant impact as a result of the failure to maintain those functions. According to Hellstrom, CI can be seen as technological systems that aggregate functions, but also vulnerabilities and pressures that could be triggered by external hazards. The increase of interconnections among sectors raised the likelihood that localized failures or disruptions could have dramatic impacts at regional or cross-boundary level. Consequently, taking into account the unforeseen nature of crises and the very complex structure of CI networks, mitigation efforts may be inadequate, especially when dealing with the cascading effects of crises. Moreover, the adaptation process of critical infrastructure to climate change scenario and to extreme events suggests the need of long-term visions that could be integrated in better strategies of planning, preparedness, and damages assessment, threat assessment. So we're looking at the discussion of this strategic intelligence report, where they are going over their analytic personal interpretation of the report, what they've gained from it, what information has been gained. Our case studies provided a range of evidences from different cultural and social contexts. What emerges is a wide picture of the vulnerability path of cascading events in line with the theory of Pasquaroli and Alexander. According to our results, the failure of critical infrastructure and its technological components can escalate the events categorized in 4 interacting areas of sensibility, gone over in Figure 10. First, the vulnerability of a network. The functional vulnerability of heavily networked urban life to critical infrastructure disruption can threaten the functioning of manifold activities, many, and delayed problems for citizens not directly affected by floods. The escalation process starts involving the area directly impacted by water, which amplifies at the regional and cross-border level. An exemplar case is the economic region Île-de-France, which is based on deeply interconnected functions at high risk of flooding. Vulnerability to society. The interdependencies of the built environment and vital functions suggest that traditional risk assessment process is generally not enough. The evidence is particularly clear in the York's case study, where it is possible to notice the failure of a strategy approved in the very same year of the event. Vulnerability to interactions among environmental and human systems. This vulnerability is shown in the Messina case, where the mismanagement and the raise of anthropic pressures increase the likelihood of chain of effects among hazard. When it clashed with the rigidities accumulated in CI, the lack of preparedness, a full cascade escalated in society. Vulnerability to NA tech escalation. Flooding events on industrial sites located in naturally hazard-prone areas may be powerful triggers for technological accidents, modifying and increasing consequences and damages in the surrounding areas. This vulnerability scenario, integrating a vulnerability scenario. In the case of cascading disasters, this is likely to be even more critical because the escalation process becomes stronger. To tackle the challenges determined by cross-temporal and spatial scales of cascading paths, the diversification of efforts made by the water authorities in charge could be determinant. The FD could benefit of integrating vulnerability scenario building instead of just being focused on risk and hazard scenarios, according with the theory of the vulnerability path. This may be done in different ways. Firstly, new assessment methodologies should integrate together social, physical, and structural drivers, taking as reference respectively the community, the environment, and the buildings, and defining the sensibility of areas to flood-triggered cascading. Secondly, GIS databases could be used to combine the likelihood of interactions among different hazards with variables such as the development of strategic land use planning or the level of maintenance and preparedness of the critical infrastructure system. Finally, the presence of infrastructural nodes should take more relevance and be contextualized in their socioeconomic and ecological context. This may provide a better perspective on the NA tech escalation, which is likely to have more of an impact in areas of high pre-impact vulnerability. They've drawn conclusions and they say that the paper represents a preliminary overview on the relationship between cascading events and the European Union Floods Directive. Therefore, it is not pretended to be exhaustive. This acknowledges their limitations. In other words, further research is needed to define how and in which form a better understanding of vulnerabilities can improve the effectiveness of mitigation measures and preparedness practices. The work for a better integration of cascading paths in the present legislation has just begun. And how would a terrorist be able to use this information? And regarding critical infrastructure, now we understand that areas prone to flooding qualify as critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure comes into consideration even with natural events like flooding.